Our next section comes from Mark 5, 1-20. If you want to follow on, this is a rather long section of text. It's on 816 in your pew Bible. So what we just read, they're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, the lake, and then they're going to go to the other side now. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of that man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. This is the word of the Lord. So last week, Ty walked us through a series of parables that were found in Mark chapter 4. These parables actually started 2 weeks ago when I preached on the parable of the sower, and I really believe that these parables are getting at this one basic point, which is that we often find God in the world in the places that we least expect. Particularly in those moments where we ask the question, where was God in the midst of that horrible tragedy? I think that Jesus is saying through those various parables that Ty was talking about, that if you look closely, you're going to find God the most when you see those tragedies. And that theme of finding God in the darkest places of life, that continues into our reading for today. So let's talk about what's going on here. So Jesus, he just stopped teaching and preaching, and he gets launched out into the boat into what is known as the Sea of Galilee. It's really a large lake, so let's just go with that. It's a lake, right? So he's in the lake, and it's nighttime, and he's tired from teaching and preaching and talking to all these people, so he decides he's going to get some sleep. So he gets into the hull of this boat, and he lays down and goes to sleep. Well, in the middle of this, while he's sleeping, this storm comes upon the Lake of Galilee and threatens to capsize the boat. These storms are actually very, very common on this lake. And they still happen to this day. If you were to go over to Israel and you were to go to the Lake of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, those storms come upon it usually once a day or so. And because these large winds come from the eastern flat plains, and they just rush onto this lake, and they can cause waves up to 10 feet tall. They've done scans of the bottom of this lake, and they have found debris from dozens of shipwrecks over the centuries. So Jesus' disciples, they're in this boat, and I think they're assuming, eventually this guy's going to wake up because, it's rocking back and forth, but he's just sleeping there, and he's not seeming to wake up. So they're kind of like, well, what do we do? They're looking at each other, and they figure, well, we'll just let him rest until the point when it looks like they're going to die. And then they're like, all right, we need to get this guy up. So they get him up, and immediately from there, what does Jesus do? He calms the winds and the storm. Now, this story is designed to catch us off guard Because up until this point, we've seen that Jesus has the power to heal. But the power to control the weather and nature, that's something we haven't seen before. You need to have a little bit of context to understand what's going on in this story. For the Jews, they believed that the only being that was capable of controlling nature was who? God. It's the one. Remember, there's 3 answers in church: God, Jesus, love. Right? Those are the 3 answers. If you do one of those, you're probably going to be pretty close. So, God, right? That was the one. So, the fact that Jesus has this same basic power, it points to the fact that Jesus has this intimate connection with God. A lot of times pastors look at this passage and they say, well, this is Mark's way of saying that Jesus was God, because if he has the same power, then obviously they are one and the same. That would be true if it wasn't for the fact that other Jews were said to possess this power as well. The prophet Elijah from the Old Testament, he was able to control the weather. That's why Jesus is often compared to Elijah. But more than likely, this story came from a rabbi that lived about a century before Jesus. His name was Honi the Circle Maker. I don't know why he was called the Circle Maker, but that was what he did. He made circles of people. He was good at small groups. I guess that was his main thing. So, Honi the Circle Maker, this guy had the ability to control the weather. And so it was said of him that when the world was in a season of drought, the sages came to him and they said, Honi, we need you to make it rain. And because he had so much faith, he went to God and God made it rain. Now the point of this is not the fact that these guys are God. The point is that in each situation, these people are intimately connected with God. And that's why Jesus says at the end, don't you have any faith? Because it's the faith that allows you to have that deep connection where you can control the weather. So the more faith you have, the less you can make it snow, the warmer it can be. So get some faith, because we need to make this thing get to spring, right? That's what we're working towards. So now that Jesus is up, he decides he wants to go to the other side of the lake. And you have to understand, we're getting the monitors in, by the way, in a couple of weeks, so I can actually show you this stuff. But you have to imagine, just imagine a lake. On the one side of the lake, it's the Jewish side. That's where we've been through the entire Gospel of Mark. Now he's going to the other side, which is the non-Jewish side. It's also known as, do you all know the word Gentile? That's the Gentile side. So he goes to this other side of the lake, and Mark designs this scene to be like something out of a horror film. Because you have to remember, it's in the middle of the night, and it's not like today where there's lights everywhere at night. It's like pitch black. They step off the boat, and they find themselves next to a graveyard. And as soon as they get off the boat, this man comes bolting out of the tombs at Jesus. Now, this is the point in the horror film at which everybody jumps out of the seat because they know something bad is about to go down, and somebody's not going to make it through the end of this scene, right? But this is not what happens. This man gets to Jesus, he bows down before him, and we found out that this man's name is Legion. Now, a legion was the most basic unit in the Roman military. It's comprised of about 5,000 different soldiers. Now, when you think about that, the reason why they called this man Legion is presumably because of the number of demons that inhabited his body. Today, we would not call Legion a demon-possessed man. We would probably refer to him as a schizophrenic. Now, schizophrenia is a mental disorder where a person hears voices in their heads. If you've ever seen schizophrenics portrayed in movies, they always portray it as the schizophrenic has some kind of visual delusion, right? They see people who aren't real. But in reality, that's very, very rare. Most people who are schizophrenics have simply auditory hallucinations. It's very rare for them to have anything that's visual. Now, we can't be 100% sure that Legion is a schizophrenic, but I think there's a lot of things in this story that point to that fact. Many of you know from being here during previous sermons that I actually spent time working as a chaplain at a mental hospital. And where I worked was a place called Trenton Psychiatric Hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. I've told you about this before. I want to tell you more about it today. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of the hospital, how it was founded, because that's important to our story for today. So, Trenton Psychiatric Hospital was originally called the New Jersey State Hospital when it was founded in 1848. It was rather unique when it was created because it was the only hospital of its kind at the time. It was the first hospital ever created specifically for the mentally ill. Its founder, a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix, created the hospital because she realized that many families with mentally ill family members lacked the ability to care for their loved ones. What would happen is she would go to their houses, and you know where they were keeping their family members? Was in basements and cellars, and they would usually shackle them, chain them to the walls in these cellars, and they usually never left. And this is because people who have things like schizophrenia, particularly if it's very severe, they develop paranoia, and they can tend to hurt themselves and others. And so they wanted to isolate them away from everyone else, even their own family. Thankfully, Dorothea Dix had a very different perspective and attitude towards the mentally ill. She created the New Jersey State Hospital with the belief that every single person, regardless of their mental illness, has worth. The facility she created was immaculate. Here's where I click forward and show you some photos of the facility. But it was beautiful. It was built in this wonderful, wonderful architectural style that it's a gorgeous facility. And everybody who came there, they would eat on fine china. Now, the reason why they would eat on fine china is because a lot of the people who were coming there came from wealthy families. And they wanted the experience of living at the hospital to be just as dignified as when they were living at home. Everybody who lived there was expected to contribute in some form or another to the community. It could be as simple as working in the gardens, milking the cows, or it could be weaving rugs, or doing woodworking or metalworking. Everybody was expected to contribute in some way or another, and it created this very tight community where patients were like family to one another. But what changed the landscape of mental illness even more than Dorothea Dix was when Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung founded the science of psychology at the turn of the 20th century. What they discovered was that certain kinds of mental illness could be treated through what was known as talk therapy. So that means you go in, you sit down with a therapist, and you talk through your issues, and by getting to the core of them, you are able to overturn that mental illness. This is particularly true of people with depression. But then, what happened even more to turn over the landscape was when pharmaceutical companies started producing drugs that could target specific disorders. Doctors found that given a certain medication or combination of medications, that a person could manage their mental illness and live a relatively normal life. Now, it's hard for me to emphasize to you just how huge the introductions of drugs have been to our understanding of mental illness in our society. So, when Dorothea Dix created the New Jersey State Hospital in 1848, if you were sent there, you were going to be there for the rest of your life. Once you were in, there was no coming out. Now, today, we have found that mental illness is a spectrum. Not everybody who has mental illness is incapable of living a normal life. Approximately 1 in 4 people in the world have some form of mental illness. That's 25% of the population. And with the introduction of drugs, we can now manage the illness and make it a relatively insignificant part of their lives. And so this idea that people need to be sequestered off, that they need to be isolated away from the rest of society, that concept has started to fall by the wayside. In fact, the laws surrounding involuntary commitment, do you know what that means, involuntary commitment? So involuntary commitment is when your family members sign a document and you're in the hospital for the rest of your life, right? So it used to be these laws were really loose, but they were abused because certain families would be like, well, I wouldn't mind getting rid of them, so they'd sign a paper and their loved one would fall into the hospital forever. And so they tightened these laws quite a bit so that you couldn't just do that whenever you wanted to. What came about from this is that places like Trenton Psych ended up housing the worst 5% of those who suffer from mental illness. So when I was there, I was working with people whose mental illness had essentially destroyed their ability to live, and they were almost all there under court mandate. So I was working with murderers and rapists. I was working with pedophiles and drug addicts. I was working with people who had essentially had their lives totally decimated by their mental illness. I remember my first day on the units. I'm getting shown around, right? I walk onto my unit, and I go up to this guy named Felix. And the first thing Felix says to me is he says, "I'm going to slit you from your stomach to your throat." And I was like, I have made the wrong decision by coming here. Now, my supervisor, who's standing right next to me, you know what she said? She goes, "Now, Felix, that's not a very nice thing to say, now is it?" Now, I came to find that these threats are very common. 99.9% of the time, they didn't mean anything. The 0.1%, sometimes they did. But 99.9, you didn't really have to worry about it. I also came to realize that all of us suffer from some kind of mental illness. There is nobody who doesn't have some sort of mental illness in their life. To be perfectly frank with you, I had trouble telling the difference between the patients and the employees sometimes when I was working there. Like you'd see a patient flying off the handle, and you realize midway through, that's not a patient at all. Oh wait, that's Bob, one of the orderlies. And so you're like getting the patients over here away from Bob, right? And you're thinking to yourself, these people over here, they have to be here. They can't get out. But this guy, he can go into the world and do whatever he wants to do. Now, I tell you these stories not only because they're kind of funny, but because they also point to this larger truth about our society, which is that the types of people who end up committing these horrific crimes are not just people with mental illness who live right next door to you and to me. The people who end up committing these horrific crimes could easily be you or me. It is a fine line between what we consider to be normal and sane, we'll make you all the sane side, and then what you would consider to be mentally ill or insane. Own it, okay? That's what you have to do. Given the right circumstances, the right kind of situation, any of us can snap. And if you don't believe me, I'd like to point out to you the fact that the most prominent form of mental illness is anxiety disorder. Now, we don't often associate anxiety with mental illness because anxiety is such a prevalent part of our lives. Every single person in here suffers from anxiety, right? But 40 million people have some form of anxiety disorder. And you want to know what the difference is between the people who are considered mentally ill and non-mentally ill? The only difference is whether or not your anxiety is debilitating. Does your anxiety prevent you from living a normal life? Well, I'd say most of us would say no. But then you change a few small things here or there in your life, and all of a sudden, what used to be bearable can very quickly become unbearable. It is estimated that for people between the ages of 18 and 35, I am still in that demographic, that, barely, that more than 50% of those people suffer from some form of anxiety disorder. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. They can't get jobs. They have huge amounts of school debt, more than at any other point in American history. They can't maintain a stable relationship because they always have to move around looking for work. So their life is in a constant state of flux. And after a while, they begin to question their worth as an individual. For some people, that anxiety starts to give way to depression. 90% of all suicides can be attributed to some form of diagnosable mental illness. From there, it is not too much of a stretch to understand how certain people, despondent about their circumstances, feeling powerless to change the hand they've been dealt, would be willing to hurt themselves and others to make a statement that every single person in here wants to make. The statement that says, whether you like it or not, I matter. And it is here, in this precise moment, when people are spiraling downward into a place so dark that they cannot return, that Jesus can be of most use to us. What you may have noticed from what I read about this guy, Legion, is that he lives in that graveyard. He wasn't just passing through when Jesus came by onto the shore. He's like, oh, hey, Jesus, what's up? He lives in that place. That's his home. That's where he lives. And what it also says is that he was often restrained with chains
and shackles. Sound familiar to what Dorothea Dix had to deal with? That's how long ago they were doing that. And even before that, that's how they would deal with it. We've only been dealing with it differently for about 150 years, which is really sad. It also says that he was so strong that he could break out of these chains. Now that might sound like something out of a film, right? But I'll tell you right now, from my time at Trenton Psych, I found that people who have severe mental illness, that they usually have this short circuit in their brain that doesn't let them know how physically limited they are. Most of the people with whom I worked were incredibly strong, almost to the point of being superhuman. I once saw a guy pick up a 200-pound sofa by himself, and he chucked it 15 feet through the air down the hallway at another patient at whom he was angry. It took 6 orderlies to bring this guy to the ground. And the orderlies at Trenton Psych are not small people. Superhuman strength in some way. So that's not a lie in any way. So it is clear from Mark's description of Legion that he is a dangerous man. Prone to violence, he would not only hurt others, but he would also hurt himself. But what you might have noticed is that Jesus is not scared of Legion. He doesn't run away. He's not scared by his condition. In fact, like Dorothea Dix, he embraces Legion. He treats him like a human being. He treats him as a person who has intrinsic worth and value, which compared with the rest of society, that's a big deal because everybody else has abandoned him. Remember, this guy lives in a graveyard. So the message being sent to him by his friends and family couldn't be clearer. You don't belong with the living. You should be dead. Sadly, the message that we send to mentally ill today in our modern society has not changed much since Jesus' time. Today, the mentally ill are still ostracized and often isolated from everyone else, which only enhances the possibility that they're going to lash out. But Jesus, he treats Legion with dignity. He shows him that there's somebody who cares about him, that his life matters. When I was working at the hospital, I was tasked with leading spiritual therapy groups where I'm supposed to take the Bible and use that as a way to help them come to terms with their mental illness. But many of these people were so sick that even on medication, they had trouble understanding even the most basic of concepts. They were like human shells, almost as if their mental illness had robbed them of their humanity. Every week, we would come back and I would try some different approach, some different angle, some new way of trying to get through to them, but nothing worked. Until one week, we talked about the concept of hope. The hope that they could get better. The hope that they could one day gain back what they had lost. The hope that they could leave that hospital and never, ever return. Every single person, regardless of how sick they were, regardless of how lost or deluded, they all responded to that idea of hope. And that is when I realized that if a person has been robbed of their humanity and they can still respond to hope, then hope is the only universal human constant. Somewhere deep down inside of all of us, no matter how much we have endured, no matter how much we have suffered, no matter how much we have lost, there is this seed of hope. When Jesus embraced Legion, he brought that seed to life. He gave Legion hope. And that is what Jesus is calling all of us to do in here. Jesus is asking us to go into our communities and find those people who are lost, isolated, and alone, and bring them hope. He wants us to let them know that their lives have value, that their lives matter, that they don't belong in a graveyard. Like Jesus, we need to show them love, and if possible, guide them towards the path to treatment. So my prayer for you today is that you might have the courage of Jesus to step outside of your comfort zone and embrace the legions of people in this world who believe that their lives don't matter. May you bring them hope that their mental illness does not have to define who they are, but is a journey that can end with a better life. Amen.